All right, everyone, get ready for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going somewhere you might not expect. The world of Tinder.
Tinder. That's right.
Tinder, the dating app.
Okay. Interesting.
We're looking at this article with a pretty wild title. It's called How Tinder Violates Human Rights, Blocking Introverts Based on Nationality and Racism.
Whoa. Human rights violations.
Yeah.
That's a pretty heavy accusation for a dating app.
Right. It's written by Dmitrii Gorbatenko. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. Whether something designed for fun and connection could actually be creating barriers.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't think a dating app would be the center of a human rights debate, but I guess anything's possible.
That's what we're here to find out. Just to be super clear up front, though, we're focusing specifically on the claims made in this article. It's just one perspective. We're not saying this is the definitive take on Tinder.
Of course, it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, exactly. So let's jump into it. The article starts off by saying that Tinder's design, while it might work great for some people, could actually be putting introverts at a disadvantage.
That's interesting. How so?
Well, they're basically saying that the algorithm, the thing that decides who sees your profile and all that, might punish introverts for being well introverted.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. So, like, introverts might take a little longer to send a message, or maybe they're more picky about who they swipe right on.
Exactly.
And the algorithm might misinterpret that. It might see that slower pace and think, oh, this person's not really active, and then, shadow ban them or something.
Yeah, basically make their profile invisible.
Wow, so you're trying to find a match, but the app itself is working against you. That's tough.
It really is. And it raises all these questions about, like, what does fairness even mean when you have these algorithms making decisions?
It's a really good point. I mean, wouldn't Tinder just say that their algorithm is just reflecting what users want?
That's what they'd probably say.
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, where do you draw the line between user preference and algorithmic bias? Is it really just a neutral reflection of what people want? Or is the algorithm itself shaping those preferences?
Yeah, because it's not just about dating apps either. This is a huge conversation happening around algorithms in general, whether it's social media, job applications, all sorts of things.
It's like this hidden layer of decision-making that's happening all around us.
Yeah.
And most of us have no idea how it works.
It's true. And that lack of transparency is a big part of the problem.
Okay, so moving on from the introvert thing. Yeah. The article then gets into some pretty serious allegations about nationality-based concerns on Tinder.
Oh, wow. Like what?
So they're suggesting that the app might be limiting the visibility of profiles from certain countries, or maybe flagging those accounts more often, basically making it harder for people from certain places to use the app.
That sounds a lot like what people call digital redlining.
Digital redlining.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the term redlining?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's like when banks or insurance companies refuse to give loans or services to people in certain neighborhoods.
Right, exactly. Historically, it was often based on race or ethnicity. So digital redlining is basically the same idea, but it's happening online.
So instead of denying loans, they're denying access to connections and opportunities within the app.
Precisely. It's like there are these invisible borders drawn within Tinder, and where you're from determines what kind of experience you'll have.
That's kind of disturbing, especially if you think about regions where access to global communities is already limited.
Yeah, it creates this whole other layer of inequality.
And speaking of inequality, the article doesn't shy away from talking about racism on Tinder either.
Oh, of course. That's a big one.
They bring it up in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
First, they highlight all these reports from users who say they've received explicitly racist messages.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Unfortunately, that's pretty common on a lot of online platforms.
But then they go even further and suggest that there might be algorithmic bias happening too.
Wait, so you're saying that the algorithm itself might be discriminating against certain races?
That's what the article is suggesting. That the way the algorithm works could be contributing to racial disparities in how people are matched and interacted with.
Wow, so it's not just about individual bad actors. The system itself could be playing a role.
Exactly. And that brings up this whole other debate about the responsibility of tech companies.
Right. Like, do platforms like Tinder have an obligation to actively combat racism and other forms of discrimination that show up in their spaces?
Or are they just a neutral platform where whatever happens, happens?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Because on the one hand, you have freedom of speech and all that. But on the other hand, you have these platforms that are clearly having a huge impact on society.
And with that impact comes a certain level of responsibility. At least that's what a lot of people are arguing.
It's a conversation that's happening all over the place right now. content moderation, the role of tech companies in shaping online discourse. It's a big deal.
It really is.
Yeah.
Okay, so to get to the heart of the article's argument, they're basically saying that if these allegations are true, Tinder's practices could actually be violating fundamental human rights.
Human rights. Wow. That's a big jump.
It is. But it raises a really interesting question, especially in this digital age, is access to dating apps, and by extension, the potential for connection that they offer, a human right?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, we have all these declarations of human rights that were written way before dating apps even existed.
Right. So how do we apply those principles to this whole new digital landscape?
Yeah. It's like we're in uncharted territory here.
Exactly. And if we were to say that access to these platforms is a right, then what does that mean for companies like Tinder? What responsibilities do they have?
Right. Because if it's a right, then they can't just exclude people based on arbitrary factors like personality type, nationality, or race.
And those are all issues that the article raises. So it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly.
It definitely does. It's making me think about all this in a whole new way.
Me too. It's like you download dating app thinking it's just going to be a fun way to meet people.
Right. Totally.
But then you realize that there are all these other layers, these ethical and societal implications that you never even considered.
It's true. And I think that's the point the article is trying to make, that we need to be more aware of these things, even when it comes to something as seemingly simple as a dating app.
I think so too. Because whether we realize it or not, these technologies are having a huge impact on our lives.
Absolutely. And it's up to us to make sure that impact is a positive one. Yeah, it really does get complicated. And it makes you think, are we handing over too much power to these algorithms?
That's a great question. Because on the one hand, you have these platforms that are, well, they're businesses, right? They have their own goals and their own bottom line.
Right, of course.
But then on the other hand, they've become such a big part of our lives, especially when it comes to dating.
It's true. It's like, for a lot of people, especially younger generations, these apps are the main way they meet people.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not just about finding a date. It's about socializing, connecting, building relationships.
And if you're being excluded from those spaces, whether it's intentional or not, that has real consequences.
Absolutely. And that's why this whole discussion about algorithmic bias and discrimination is so important. We can't just pretend that these algorithms are neutral, like there's some kind of objective force.
Right. They're designed by people. They're based on data that's collected and interpreted by people. There's always going to be some level of human bias baked into the system.
And the article goes even further than that. It actually suggests that Tinder's practices, if all these allegations are true, could be violating human rights.
Human rights? Wow, that's a serious accusation.
It is. But it raises a fascinating question. Is access to these kinds of platforms, to dating apps, a human right?
That's a tough one. I mean, how do you even begin to define that? Human rights are usually about things like freedom of speech, freedom from discrimination, the right to life, liberty, security.
Right, things that are considered fundamental to human dignity.
Exactly. So is access to a dating app really on that same level?
It's debatable. But the article makes the case that in the digital age, these platforms have become so essential to social interaction that maybe they should be considered a kind of digital right.
I see what they're saying. It's like, if you're being systematically excluded from these spaces, you're being denied opportunities to connect with other people, to form relationships, to build a social life.
And those are all things that are crucial to human well-being.
Right. So maybe, in a way, access to these platforms is a kind of prerequisite for being able to fully participate in modern society.
And if that's the case, then platforms like Tinder have a responsibility to ensure that everyone has equal access.
Exactly. They can't just be picking and choosing who gets to participate based on arbitrary factors like whether someone's an introvert or what country they're from or the color of their skin.
And those are all things that the article accuses Tinder of doing.
Right. So it really comes down to this question of what responsibilities do these companies have? Are they just neutral platforms, or do they have a moral obligation to create a more equitable and inclusive environment?
It's a huge question, and there's no easy answer.
It's something that society is grappling with right now, not just with dating apps, but with all kinds of technology.
Yeah, it's like we're at this turning point where we're starting to realize the enormous power of these technologies.
And we're trying to figure out how to use that power responsibly.
So to bring it back to this deep dive, the article we've been discussing is just one perspective on a very complex issue.
Of course. It's just a starting point.
Right. And we always encourage our listeners to do their own research,
Sure.
to form their own opinions. But I think this conversation has been really valuable, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's made me think about all this in a whole new way.
Me too. And I'm sure it's done the same for our listeners.
I hope so, because these are conversations that we need to be having.
Now, before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear what stood out to you the most from this deep dive. What really got you thinking?
You know, it really got me. It was that whole idea of the algorithm potentially punishing introverts. Like you said, it's not necessarily intentional, but it's still a form of bias.
Yeah.
And it made me realize that, I don't know, it made me realize that we often think of algorithms as being purely objective, but they're not. They're created by people.
Yeah.
And people have biases, whether they're conscious of them or not.
It's so true. And it's not just about introverts either. The article talks about how the algorithm might be disadvantaging people based on their nationality or their race.
Right. And that's where it gets really serious, because then you're talking about potential human rights violations like we were discussing earlier.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how widespread is this kind of algorithmic bias? Is it happening on other platforms too?
I bet it is. It's probably happening in all sorts of places. We just don't realize it because it's all happening behind the scenes, you know?
It's like this hidden layer of decision-making that's shaping our lives in ways we don't even fully understand. And the scary thing is, it's only going to get more prevalent as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated.
Right, because AI is basically built on algorithms.
Yeah.
So the more powerful AI becomes, the more important it is that we address these issues of bias.
So what can we do about it? I mean, as individuals,
Yeah.
it feels kind of overwhelming.
Well, I think the first step is awareness, like we've been talking about. Just being conscious of the fact that these algorithms exist and that they're not perfect, they can be biased, they can perpetuate inequalities.
So we need to be more critical of the technology we use.
Exactly. Don't just accept it blindly. Ask questions. Demand transparency from the companies that create these algorithms.
It's almost like we need to develop a new kind of literacy,
Yeah.
a way of understanding and evaluating the algorithms that are shaping our world.
I love that algorithmic literacy. That's a great way to put it.
Because if we don't understand how these systems work, we're basically at their mercy.
Right. We become passive consumers of technology instead of active participants in shaping the digital landscape.
And that's not a future I want to live in.
Me neither. I think we all have a responsibility to push for a more ethical and equitable use of technology.
Well, on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
We have. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
It has. Who knew that a deep dive into Tinder could lead to such profound discussions about algorithms and bias and the future of technology?
It's amazing how these seemingly simple things can connect such bigger issues.
So true. So for all our listeners out there, as you go about your day, pay attention to the ways in which algorithms are shaping your experiences. Ask yourself, are they working for you or against you? And what can you do to make a difference?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious.